The last major project for my harbor scene is adding a tugboat next to the railcar float in this space that I purposely left free of water. Originally I had planned on scratch building it, but I'm not a model ship builder, so when I got my 3D resin printer last year, I knew that printing it would make the most sense. I found this model on Thingiverse, and other than the wake it comes with as a display stand, it was just the right model. Luckily, the wake was a separate piece that I just didn't print. I had to scale it down to N scale. The bridge and the cabin part wasn't an issue as it was small enough to fit on my printer, but I had a lot of issues with the hull. More on that later. The bridge came out really clean with minimal supports to remove. I did have to do a bit of work to get the pins on the separate stairways to fit into the sockets on the bridge. It was a tight fit. Nothing a bit of scraping with my hobby knife couldn't fix. I then also sanded the bottom flat where most of the supports were to get it a bit smoother. It will fit into a socket on the hull, so it doesn't have to be perfect. Now onto the hull. After several failed prints which wasted quite a bit of time and resin, I finally dialed in my exposure settings and had a successful print. I was so happy. I did split the hull in half, mainly to fit it better on the build plate, but also to allow the draining of resin as I hollowed it out. Once printed, I sanded it down and made some adjustments to the socket where the bridge inserts into. I then used some thick CA glue to glue the two halves together. There were some gaps, so I used some auto body putty to close them up. This looked okay after some sanding and reapplying the putty. But then I resorted to using BS, baking soda, and CA glue for a stronger joint. After giving it a prime coat with my airbrush, I brush painted on some brick red on the lower part of the hull. I then painted the deck with none other than Deck Tan from Vallejo. Only it wasn't really the right color I was after, so later I painted it with a browner color. I also primed the bridge off camera and painted it blue. I picked out some of the details such as the emergency boat canisters and funnel with white paint. I also painted the mast silver and then glued on a very small white LED. I drilled a small hole with my pin vise for the wires of the LED. Luckily the bridge, like the hull, is hollow. But it meant also drilling another hole in the base. It would have been easier if I would have planned ahead and added these holes in my slicer, but sometimes these things happen. I actually ended up using one of my Forstner bits to hand drill the hole, as I was afraid of cracking the resin if I drilled with my power drill. I still had to use a stiff wire to pull the LED wires down through the hole. I tested with a pair of AA batteries to make sure it works. And then to glue the wires to the mast to tidy them up. A hollow mast would have been better, but at this scale might have been too weak. I then painted the stairway tread silver and also the deck surfaces. It's a bit tricky and it made me realize I need some finer paintbrushes. I then painted all the railings white. The railings are a bit too thick for my liking, but for now I'll put up with them, and in future I might replace them with more in-scale railings. I then glued the stairways in place. The LED wires I found were hard to paint with acrylic paints. They just didn't seem to stick. My chrome paint pen though seemed to work. As you can see, I also drilled a big hole in the wall for the wires. This I was able to do on my drill press with a larger Forstner bit. The fit is good with the bridge, and I tested the LED again. I was a bit paranoid that I might have damaged a wire. When one LED is good, more or better, right? I decided to also add red and green navigation lights to the bridge, and that required more holes to be drilled. I then threaded the LEDs down, glued them in place, and tested them. The green one works. You'll see the red one later. I then proceeded to paint the portholes. I went for a chrome look with my paint pen on the porthole frames. And then with a pointy toothpick and black paint, I blacked out the glass, as the portholes and windows on this bridge are not see-through. My painting wasn't perfect, so I had to do a bit of touch-up with blue paint. I then used some gloss acrylic varnish and a touch of black paint to make the portholes look like glass reflecting sunlight. This worked okay, but I ended up adding another coat of just varnish off camera. And then I did the other windows the same way. Off camera, I 3D printed and painted Captain George. He's been the captain of this tugboat for over 20 years. He's standing on the bridge, watching over the operations on the float, waiting until he can tow the float across the harbor to the neighboring city. He's tiny, just 12 millimeters tall, even though in real life, he's a good 6 foot 3 inches tall. Now more lights. After researching what lights a typical tugboat has, I needed to add a white light and a yellow light to the back to show that the tug is towing. Since the wires on the new LEDs I bought were a bit thick, I ended up making the mast by simply taping together the wires and painting them silver. Somehow I forgot to record that. Tested them again, and then I drilled a hole in the back to install them with some CA glue. The tug needs a winch on the front. I 3D printed it as well and painted it the same blue. I then borrowed some thread from my wife's sewing box and painstakingly wrapped it around the winch spools. I had to use a needle to get it through the underside of the spool. On one of the spools I glued a loop, and on the other one I left a long piece to eventually wrap around a cleat on the car float. I couldn't wait, and I placed the tugboat on the layout. It's looking great, but one more detail that I need to add before I permanently glue it down. But first I found the funnel a bit too white, so I masked it off and added a light blue to it. Later I might make a white decal once I figure out a company logo. And I still need to figure out a name for the tugboat as well. I also 3D printed some truck tires to act as bumpers for the tug to save that beautiful black paint. I did try to paint them on the supports, but ended up needing to also paint the underside, so I took them off the supports. Gave them a good sanding to remove the support remnants, and then stuck them on a skewer. Anyone interested in barbecued tires for lunch? These were then easy to paint black. Once I took them off the skewer, I also painted the insides. I'm still amazed at the detail resin printing gives you. The treads are visible even though these tires are less than the diameter of a standard pencil. I first glued the tires onto the sides, starting at the front. I used a toothpick to space them the same distance apart. Once these were glued in place, I broke out the thread again, and I made a loop around the tire and glued the ends of the thread to the top of the gunnel. I think that's what it's called. This was difficult work, and without my magnifiers would have been almost impossible. Once the glue set, I trimmed off the threads. I then took a thin styrene rod and glued it on top of the gunnel to hide the ends of the thread. It wasn't the best solution, but it looks okay. In hindsight, I probably should have modified the model to include some holes through which the threads could simply go, just like on an actual tugboat. The rod was painted black, and by the way, you may notice that I had already done the other side off camera. I wasn't confident in my plan for these tires, so I just wanted to try them out first before I committed to making this video showing you. Final step was to lengthen the wires for the LEDs to reach my terminal block under the layout. A length of telephone wire was soldered on with color-coded shrink wrap to cover the joints. And here the umbilical cords are ready to be threaded down and connected. I added 6 dots of tacky craft glue to secure the tugboat in its final resting position in the harbor. I just had to make sure the holes in the hull aligned with the holes on the plywood base. Under the layout, I attached the wires. I bought a couple of these power distribution blocks. I'll leave a link in the description below. These are great when you have bus wires underneath your layout. You just splice one of these in using the 2 end terminals and then can connect up to 12 devices to the block to feed power to them. I'll definitely be getting more of these and replacing my existing wiring under the layout. I'll also do a video showing what I use to power the sliding bus with 3-volt power so that I don't need to use resistors. So let's turn the power on and see how they look. Nice. My iPhone camera unfortunately is washing out the very bright LED in the back. I think I'll need to throw a resistor on it at some point to bring the brightness down, and here are some nighttime shots. I might also wire up the green and red navigation lights and the tow lights on the back to a switch so I can turn them on and off manually. That can then indicate when the float is being moved, even though it won't physically be moved. One final step is to attach the loose thread to the Railcar float cleat. After wrapping it around a few times, I secured the end with CA and then cut off the extra. And there we go. Tugboat is in place. Finally, I can add some water around it. Again, I'm using acrylic gel medium and a small spatula. I'll leave a link in the description to both of these. I'm not that happy with the bridge and cabin. I think I will modify the 3D STL file, removing the chunky railings and making see-through windows and portholes with a simple interior. I can then easily reprint it, paint it, and this time with my airbrush, as close up the paint is not that smooth, and replace the current one. If I missed anything on this tug, please let me know. I do plan to add a few more things to the deck, along with maybe a sailor or 2. And stay tuned for the next video in this series, where I add a few more details to this whole harbor scene. As always, thanks for watching.